Meanwhile, South Africa has commended the International Criminal Court the prosecutor there, Karim Khan's decision to seek arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister and his defense minister, including 3 leaders of Hamas for alleged war crimes. The Department of International Relations is calling for the law to be applied equally to ensure accountability for those responsible for human rights violations in the deadly war in Gaza. And let's speak about this now. And we are joined by the Director-General at Dirco, Zane Dangor. DG, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. You have heard the comments from the Israeli government spokesperson that no power in the world will stop Israel from defending itself. What would you ideally want that court decision, which is expected tomorrow from the ICJ, to spell out exactly about this ongoing war?
Good evening, Coley. I think the word that you used is operative, it's spell out. We went back to the court for a 3rd time to ask for provisional orders, especially with the then planned ground offensive in Rafah. But after the application, we saw increased attacks, even in the so-called safe zones in the north. What we're asking the court is to be very specific in its orders this time. It's given orders and inferred in those orders that military actions must stop, that humanitarian supplies must flow unhindered. But because the language was not as specific as it could be, Israel sought to interpret that as a license to continue with its atrocities. So we are hoping that tomorrow at 3 p.m., the court is very specific and orders very specifically for an end to military assaults, the end to the military activities, so that peace can prevail. And with peace prevailing, the humanitarian aid can flow. And that lays the basis for talks. You cannot engage in any meaningful talks while a de facto genocide, a textbook case of genocide, is unfolding. So we're hoping that the court will be very specific in ordering for. We can't use the term ceasefire legally at the ICJ, but we're hoping for a de facto ceasefire to be called for.
Yeah. DJ, you'll forgive for this question because it almost seems a question that is almost like a stark record. There is this view, a very strong one, that whatever the court orders, the International Court of Justice orders, those recommendations, those instructions are not enforceable. If you want for any military action to stop, that's got to be done at the level of the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. How do you navigate that space? How do you respond to that?
So we've got to do work at 2 tracks. So firstly, the action that we've taken at the ICJ is it's an Article 9 action, which means that any orders that emerge from that are binding. They're not just binding onto Israel and to South Africa, who are parties of this case, but they're also binding to 3rd parties, which means any state that is a member of the convention, the Genocide Convention, must abide, not, but with them not may, must. So it's also binding on 3rd-party states such as the US and others. Now, we've seen that the previous provisional orders have been ignored, and we raised this in our most recent application. We're also going to be working to ensure that the Security Council respects the Charter's injunction for it to enforce provisional orders and binding orders from the ICJ. I think the lack of compliance, not just now, but for many, many years, with not just ICJ binding orders, but also with binding Security Council orders, has given reason to what we call this institutionalized impunity, which has allowed Israel to think they can behave in the manner in which they currently are and get away with it.
Yeah.
Because frankly, they have been allowed to get away with it.
Let's then talk about a different court, also at The Hague, but slightly removed from the ICJ. You were, in fact, in The Hague when the announcement came from the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, who says he plans to secure arrest warrants for both players in this war. How optimistic are you that these warrants will be issued anytime soon?
I think that the first major step is that the prosecutor, and working with a team of experts, a panel of experts in international criminal law, have made the recommendation that the court itself, which is the judges, issue what is called the provisional warrants of arrest. We believe that they should act speedily, given the gravity of the case. While the sort of draft crimes that they are levying against the Israelis and the three leaders from Hamas all relate to war crimes and other serious international crimes. None of them, of course, at this stage want to venture into genocide, but the crimes are serious enough that these warrants, these provisional warrants, should be issued timelessly. Yeah. It took them 2 weeks to issue the provisional warrants for President Putin for much lesser crimes. Not that we must make a distinction between these, but these crimes are serious, that it borders on what we call the crime of crimes, which is genocide from an international criminal perspective. So we don't think that they should take too long to issue these provisional warrants of arrest. It's highly unusual for the justices to ignore the request from the prosecutor, and especially given the fact that the prosecutor has been assisted by an eminent team of international jurists.
Yeah. So ideally here, DG, you understand these things better. Who would be processing these arrest warrants once they are ready for issuing?
So what normally happens is the request is made to what is called the chamber. The chamber is essentially just the judges. The judges, when they do order the provisional arrest warrants, will then transmit that through the registrar to all state parties. So all state parties, which is over 132 at this stage, will receive compliance notices, which means that all state parties will then be bound to ensure that any of these individuals on their territory will have to be arrested. So in our case, it will have to come through the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice will then have to issue domestic warrants. And this is normally the case with most other jurisdictions.
All right, we'll talk a little later about the effecting of those arrest warrants. But before we get there, let's talk about the effect of these warrants and if at all they will have any impact on the ongoing assault in Gaza. Do you think that that could make some kind of change on the ground?
I think it will have a change. You know, the difference between the ICJ is state versus state. So you're holding the state liable. And the countermeasures are against the state, normally in the form of sanctions or disqualification from the United Nations. But with legal criminal, it focuses, with criminal injunctions, it focuses on the individual. So in this case, for example, the Prime Minister of Israel himself and the Minister of Defense will be charged as individuals. The warrants of arrest will be on them as individuals, which means that any person that does not respect these warrants of arrest are in breach of their own domestic and international obligations. I do think it will have a chilling effect on even the support that Israel will be getting, because you will be supporting the state, but de facto you are supporting the individual leading that state in some of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. And we can see the reaction, for example, in the US Congress and others. They are quite concerned about the fact that this will have an impact on the unfettered ability of Israel to do what it has been able to do for many, many years. It's very important to note that when the state of Palestine tried to initially put itself under the jurisdiction of the Rome Statute as early as 2012. They were threatened with sanctions by some of the bigger countries. And that was because at that stage already, they were afraid of the impact of individual criminal sanction against leading Israeli figures involved in international crimes. So this has been one of their biggest fears, in essence.
Yeah.
So the kind of sanctions being threatened against the prosecutor and even the family of the prosecutor absurdly gives you a sense of the threat that this kind of action has on the ability of Israel to operate in a way that is unfettered. For example, today we got news that Germany has confirmed that if President Netanyahu travels to Germany and if there is a warrant of arrest, they'll be duty bound to arrest. So you can see that the impact this is having even on some of the countries that have been supporters of Israel in this current military action of theirs. So it will definitely have an impact.
In fact, you've just touched on the question I wanted to ask, that for you, South Africa, you wanted Benjamin Netanyahu alongside those he leads with in government, but in this instance, it's him and Mr. Yoav Gallant, who is the defense minister, who essentially will be indicted if indeed ultimately those arrest warrants are issued. And this is going to be for war crimes and the crime of genocide. Your expectation here would be that for any country that is a signatory to the Rome Statute, that country will effect an arrest of Mr. Netanyahu and hand him over to The Hague. Is that indeed the expectation by South Africa?
Well, I think what countries will be asked to do is to cooperate with the court, and we expect all countries to cooperate with the court. Unless there's specific impediments. If there's specific impediments, they will have to go to the court in The Hague, use what is called an Article 19 consultation to explain what these impediments may or may not be. But without any impediment, they are all duty bound to comply with the instruction to cooperate with the court.
Well, that expectation, DG, would also be expected of South Africa should any of the listed Hamas leaders set foot in South Africa. And you would know this at the start of this particular war, the Hamas leaders seemed to enjoy a particular relationship with the governing African National Congress. Would South Africa be prepared to effect an arrest of these Hamas leaders listed and hand them over to The Hague?
So if you recall that in November last year, South Africa made an application to the International Criminal Court for investigations of possible breaches of international crimes in the situation in Palestine. Very clearly in our application, we said all those responsible, if there's credible evidence, should be investigated and through the court processes get the necessary warrants of arrest out. We made it very clear that includes Hamas leaders or any other leader fighting on that particular day, October 7th. We made it very clear that while the Geneva Conventions may give people the right to resist, you cannot attack civilians. It is a war crime. So we made that very clear. So we will abide by the instructions of the court to cooperate with it for any of the individuals that are indicted.
Interesting indeed. All right. Can I sway your attention to another important matter related to the situation in Palestine? 3 EU countries will formally recognize Palestine as a state on May the 28th. I think that's next week, Tuesday. Do you believe that the two-state solution, which is what the South African government has always advocated, is brought firmly on the agenda of the United Nations once again as a direct result of the pressure that has been mounted by countries like South Africa?
Yes, I think the two-state, solution has been imperiled essentially by, since Oslo, for example, by the actions of the Israeli government through the unlawful settlements. I think the UN resolution 2 weeks ago, where member states overwhelmingly voted to recognize the fact that Palestine should have better, fuller membership, not full membership, but fuller membership of the UN. That was underpinned by the recognition that the state of Palestine should be recognized. The majority of the world's countries already recognize the state of Palestine, and with the 3 European countries now deciding that they will follow suit, I think it puts a lot more impetus towards somehow getting to a solution where the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, emerging out of the context of colonization since 1918, and also after the occupation following 1948, will get a lot more attention. It may just lead to more intense negotiations. Kali, one of the sort of almost outcomes of this ICJ case that we've taken to the court, 2 things happened. Is that for the first time ever, the lawyers speaking on behalf of the Israeli state spoke about Palestinian people. There's always been a refrain from referring to Palestinian people officially by Israeli spokespersons because they want to talk about Arabs, specifically to move away from the idea of Palestinian people or therefore a Palestinian state. And secondly, they also spoke about internationally recognized borders, which they also have not wanted to engage on before. So this, together with the recognition by countries in Europe now of a Palestinian state, will begin to frame the parameters around which negotiations for a 2-state solution, or any solution that is just for both the people of Palestine and Israel, can be negotiated around.
Sure. And so with the countries in the United Nations formation, DG, with these 3 countries, 3 European countries coming on board, how many countries within the UN that are now in favor of a Palestinian statehood versus those that have still got to come on board? And what would the numbers be for eventually Palestine being recognized as a state?
The countries that already recognize the state of Palestine, and I won't be able to give you the exact number, but it's over 130. So it's already by far the largest number of countries in the world that recognizes the state of Palestine. And I think that with more European countries coming on board, that'll strengthen the case. It's unfortunate that we always have to find European countries to endorse what the rest of the world has already endorsed for it to have any credibility. But if you look at a map of the world and you look at, if you color the countries that recognize the state of Palestine green, you'll find that it's the vast majority of the countries in the world, barring countries in the US and Western Europe.
With this matter of a possible Palestinian statehood being finally brought back once again, let me not say finally, but once again being brought firmly on the agenda of the UN, do you think that it is likely that it might lose momentum once again?
I don't think so. I think that the kind of actions that we've seen across the world, not just by governments, but just from ordinary people, has brought the Palestinians' plight, but also the need for self-determination squarely on the agenda of not just the international bodies, but also of national governments. We are now looking at the very first resolution, Resolution 181, that gave rise to the partition and the state of Palestine. That resolution, in essence, already made provision for 2 states, but only one state's rights were then manifested, which was the occupying state and the colonizing state, and the people whose land was taken away never got statehood. I think that is one of the injustices that now, 75 years later, may finally be corrected.
Yeah.
And that's also because of the ICJ case, not just the one South Africa has taken forward, but there's also another ICJ case that is looking at the illegality of the occupation over the last 7 decades. And that is also been supported by most of the countries in the world.
Sure. I may be making a mountain out of a molehill here, DG, but you'll guide. My understanding is that the negotiations between these two sides and the one that really is spoken about the world over is the Oslo Agreement. Now, Oslo is the capital of Norway, and Norway happens to be one of these 3 countries that are going to recognize a Palestine as a state come Tuesday. Is that a significant development, you think, or they should have come on board much, much earlier?
Look, we welcome the fact that Norway and Spain and Ireland are coming on board. I think any state that comes on board, we welcome. Norway has always been supportive of the Palestinian people, so has Ireland, so has Spain. They've just been, given the fact that they are part of Europe, just been slow in endorsing the fact that they needed to recognize a Palestinian state. What it does do is reflect the long-standing differences within Europe. And the need for Europe to have acted as one on this has always been on the agenda, but I think countries have now decided that they can no longer wait for a bloc decision. They will start making these decisions on their own, given the difficulty in getting a bloc decision going. So I do think it's indicative of more countries doing the same, because it is fairly reflective of the fact that there is large disagreements in Europe about how to tackle this. And with a large number of European countries wanting to support Palestine substantively based on respect for human rights, I think you can have signed more and more over the next few months coming on board.
Wow. One more topic, DJ, and I promise I will let you go. This week, very tragic events have occurred in Iran, that country losing its president alongside the foreign minister, 5 days of mourning which will come to an end, I think, the day after tomorrow. How big a blow is this, and might it have unintended consequences for the BRICS Plus nations, which include South Africa? Because now Iran had recently been absorbed into the BRICS formation.
So I think it's a tragedy, the fact that you have this helicopter accident killing the prime minister and also the foreign minister. And of course, you've seen that the president of South Africa has expressed, South Africa's condolences. I don't think that it will have any major impact on BRICS. I think the Iranians are resilient and will, find. I think there is an election that's going to be held on electing a new prime minister quite soon. But I do think that barring anything that may suggest that this was not an accident, and there's no indication to that effect, I don't think that it will have any major spillover effects on the regional politics or even the developments within BRICS.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because there may have been suggestions that this may or may not have been an accident. We know the role, or should we say, we know the accusations that are always leveled toward Iran, particularly by the Western nations. If it does come to be that these become stronger, these allegations that this may not have been an accident, do you think that could fuel the already tense situation that exists already?
So I think that, there's no evidence to at this stage, but we can't rule it out. But there's no evidence that I've seen that suggested it wasn't an accident. But if it was if there was foul play, which I hope it doesn't, I hope it is not a factor, that could have a destabilizing effect on the region, depending on, who you can attribute this to. So we all hope that none of that is at play, because it may cause for some destabilization in the region.
Sure. DG, thank you very much for your time. Director General at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Zane Dangor.